Hey everyone, this is Patrick Donahoe. It is hard to believe, but we are over halfway through our first season of 2018. So if you've just started to listen to the Well Standard podcast, we're doing things a little bit different this year. So the Well Standard is being broken into 3 120-day seasons. The first season is called Life. The second season is called Liberty, and the last season of 2018 will be called Property. So we're going to focus on each of those topics. And so if you haven't had a chance to check out our earlier episodes from Life, I highly recommend you do so. There's some awesome interviews in there. Now, this week's episode of Life is with a very special guest that I was able to connect with out in Massachusetts. His name is Peter Gray, and he has some pretty amazing views when it comes to education and creating the best possible environment for children. Now, Peter is a research psychologist at Boston College and is an expert in the field of neuroscience. Now, the reason I wanted to get him on is because I really believe, if you go back, the last couple of episodes of 2017, I look at where we're at and how you get to a point in which you view the world. And I believe that there is this significant, profound influence of public education in all of our lives. And it influences the way that we make decisions of where we work. It influences the decisions with finances, with relationships, with working with other individuals, with being friendly, and also I would say with being happy. And so I really wanted to get Peter's view on things because he has a pretty cool book called Free to Learn. He also has a really insightful TED Talk, which we're going to link to in the show notes. But his view on education, his view on children is right up my alley just because I have kids right now, and looking at how they're experiencing the world and gaining, really their MO for life. I see some disparity between what I think they need and what the public school system is providing them. So you guys are gonna love this. Now I know that Peter's opinions may raise a few eyebrows. Even when I was talking to him, there were some definite eyebrows from me being raised because his ideas are almost the opposite. And as far as what the orthodox view of public education is and educating our children. So anyway, when it comes to maximizing the greatest asset of you, which is the theme for this season, which is life, education is pertinent. So you guys are gonna love this episode. So here we go with episode number 10 with my special guest, Peter Gray.
Welcome to the special 2018 seasons of the Wealth Standard Podcast, celebrating life, liberty, and property. You are currently listening to Life Season 1.
Peter, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you.
Happy to be here.
So, Peter, why don't we start by maybe you just explaining to the audience about what you've dedicated your career to and what your mission has been with the books that you've written. You have a wonderful TED Talk, and maybe let's just start with that.
Yeah, well, I'm a research psychologist at Boston College. I taught at Boston College for 30 years. I've been doing research for about 45 years now through Boston College. I retired from teaching a while ago. For many years, I was doing what you could call neuroscience. I was studying the binding of certain hormones in the brain and trying to understand neural hormonal mechanisms in rats and mice. But I had a son who was going to school and hating it and complaining every single day and rebelling in school, kindergarten through fourth grade. By the time it reached fourth grade, the rebelling was so clear and so extreme that the teachers just really didn't know what to do with him. His mother and I were constantly being called in, and we didn't know what to do. I kept trying to say, to him, just do the work. You know, you're just making a pain of yourself. But I think it was a matter of principle to him. I mean, from kindergarten on, it was a matter of principle. He just thought he was being asked to do stupid things, that they were wasting his time, that it was being like being in prison. And he used that term. I mean, you're sending me to prison when you send me to school. And, you know, ultimately it reached a crisis point at which it became very clear to his mother and me that it was time for us to stop fighting with him about this. And we found a school with quotation marks around it that he was happy with. It's called the Sudbury Valley School. It happened to be actually within walking distance, a couple miles away from where we lived in Framingham, Massachusetts at that time. And my son thought, oh, you know, when he saw the school, he said, this is what a school should be. You know, I'm free here. I can think here. I can do what I want here. I can interact with other people over the whole range of ages. This is a school founded in 1968, so it's now about to finish its 50th year. At a time when there were a lot of sort of radical free schools founded, but this one was founded on a little bit more solid basis. They had a financial model to make it work. They had a clear constitutions, a way of solving problems and disputes. But this is a school at which there are children from age 4 through high school age enrolled, but they're not segregated by age in any way. They're not assigned to classes. They're not graded. There are, in fact, not even courses offered, although if students get together and say they'd like a course in something, they can form one and they can get a staff member to lead it generally. But it's basically a place where there are lots of kids from age 4 on through about 18 or 19 years old. Lots of things to do, lots of things to play. There's an outdoor area, there's indoor areas, there's various kinds of shops. And nobody's telling you what to do, as long as you don't break the rules, and the rules are made democratically and don't have anything to do with learning. The rules simply have to do with the kind of rules any community needs of, you know, not destroying things, not interfering with other people's rights, and so on. So although my son thought this was ideal, I was skeptical at first.
I can imagine. Yep.
I was intrigued. But I didn't want his options to be cut short by virtue of attending a school that is this radically different from what we think of as school. The result of that was that I ended up wanting to talk with graduates. I wanted to see, well, what are the people who've finished, who've gone through here, and who are out there in the world, what are they doing? And at first I kind of did this informally, and then I ended up doing this as a formal research study. I identified essentially almost all of the graduates of the school at that time. This was some time ago. The school was smaller then, but there were already about 80 graduates of the school, some of whom had done all of what would be their K through 12 education there. And I located nearly all of them. They filled out a pretty extensive questionnaire, and some of them I also interviewed either personally if they still lived in the area or by telephone. And the result of that study allowed me to relax and also led me to be just extraordinarily curious. I mean, here were young people doing, and not all that young, some of them a little bit farther along in life, doing, who had gone to a school that's nothing like what we think of as school.
It sounds like the complete opposite.
It's in many ways the complete opposite. Who had been playing, exploring, sitting around, talking, following whatever their own interests are, and they're doing okay in life. In fact, they're doing quite well in life. Those who wanted to go on to higher education because they were going into some kind of a career that required it didn't seem to have any difficulty getting in, including in some cases the pretty prestigious schools, even though they'd never taken any of the kind of required courses that colleges say you're supposed to take. Some had never taken a course before, they'd never taken a test, never read a textbook. Somehow got in, talked themselves in. These people, one thing that happens in this kind of self-directed education is you become pretty good at understanding who you are. You become pretty good at communicating with other people. You've developed some passions. You're able to talk about those passions. This is kind of impressive to college administrators because most of the young students that they're looking at don't have all that. They may have all A's. They may have perfect scores on the SATs. They maybe done the right volunteer programs. But, you talk to them and they don't seem to have a lot of true interests. They don't seem to know exactly why they want to go to college. And these ones, if they're going to college, they do, because otherwise, why would they go? They certainly didn't feel like college was a necessity. They didn't think, school below college was a necessity for learning anything. So they're going to college because they've got a reason to do it. In addition, those students who chose careers that really don't require college were doing very well out there in the world. Some had founded businesses. Some were going on in the arts. Some were crafts people doing very well. One was an inventor. One was captain of a cruise ship, just to give an example. One had gone on into the high fashion industry as a very successful pattern maker. No college for any of them. And there were others even who had gone on to academia. Or there's one who's is now a professor of mathematics. At that time was a graduate student in mathematics. So they'd gone on in the whole range. One of the things I found was that because I asked them about what they did when they were students, what kinds of, since mostly they're playing, I asked them, what did you play at? And independently of that, I was asking them about their careers. And when I put those two kinds of, the responses to those two questions together, it was very interesting to see that in about half the cases, there was a very clear relationship between what they had played at as young children at the school and what they were now doing as a career. So, that woman who was captain of a cruise ship, she was playing with boats in the pond at the school. And by the time she was a teenager, she had apprenticed herself to a ship captain on Cape Cod, took advantage of the fact you don't have to be on campus all the time. The one who's an inventor was playing a constructive place. He was building things. He was getting staff members to take him to the dump and bringing back bicycle parts and making workable bicycles and selling them for a few dollars. I could go on and on with many examples. So here are people who are spending their time doing real things that they love. And what's interesting in our society, we have in many ways such a rich culture. If you are good at something and you are passionate about it, there's a pretty good chance you can find a way to make a living doing it.
Especially in this day and age.
Especially in this day and age. So there's a certain sense, even back then, this was quite some years ago I did this study, that you could say that a large number of them were entrepreneurs in one way or another. Not surprisingly, they're not going in to become middle managers. They're not going on, for the most part, they're certainly not going, back then there were still a few assembly line jobs. Nobody was going on for those kinds of jobs. They were going on into jobs in which they were still pretty much in charge of their own lives. They were continuing a self-directed path.
Now, this is before, this is your due diligence as your son is going into this school. But then you took an approach where you dedicated a good portion of your career to it. So maybe go into the theory that you discovered around this, because it's completely unorthodox, and it's, but again, it works out in the end to what the objective of, I would say, those that do, are proponents of Common Core or typical education?
Yeah, well, so, gradually I changed fields. This was so intriguing to me. I mean, this ran so counter, and nobody else was doing this research. And for a long time, I couldn't even get anybody interested, certainly not people in schools of education. But I was just fascinated by it. And so here, these people are somehow becoming educated. If you define education as acquiring whatever knowledge and skills it is that you need to acquire to go on to a successful adult life and a happy and meaningful and productive life, they were becoming educated. Even though, the staff members certainly aren't educating them. They don't call themselves teachers. They're not teaching. There are actually relatively few staff there. Today, there's about 200 students and only 7 staff members. And the staff members kind of do all the administration and so on, So,
but I want to clarify. There are, I would say, kind of like Sudbury accredited schools around the world. You're just talking about the school that your son.
I'm talking about the one my son went to, but now there are several dozen Sudbury model schools. I wouldn't say accredited. There's no official crediting of them, but there are several dozen schools that have deliberately modeled themselves after the Sudbury Valley Schools, some of which are now really quite large and substantial and have been around for a while and have even followed up on their graduates. So it's replicable. You can, there are other people doing this. There's nothing magic about the particular staff who happened to set this one up. So this works.
And they consider it that, the students and teachers are kind of considered on the same level, right? There's no kind of hierarchy, correct?
There's no hierarchy at all in any kind of official way. All the rules of the school are made by vote at the school meeting. The school meeting meets once a week, and whether you're 4 years old or whether you are an adult staff member, you have one vote. As I said, there are 200 students and 7 staff members. So if it were ever students versus staff, which of course it never is in a setting like this, you would know who would win. So you could say the schools. The other thing, to be a staff member there, you have to be voted back in every year. No staff member has tenure. You have a 1-year contract, which has to be renewed every single year. And if the majority of the members of the school meeting, the majority of staff and students combined, vote against you, you're not going to be back on the staff the following year. That having been said, a couple of the people who are in the founding group of the school are still there. They've been reelected to staff every year for 50 years now. But there are people who've come and gone. There are people who've wanted to be staff and never got elected. And there are people who've been staff for a while and did not get reelected. So what a brilliant way to have staff. Most people think that's crazy. I've even heard people say, it's like asking the insane in an insane asylum to run the asylum. What an awful concept about what children are. Children are really not insane. No. Children know what their self-interest is, and they can distinguish between staff members who are really doing the work there and really helping the school go and are helpful to them, and staff members who are not so helpful. Even though some of the staff members who've left, who've been not voted back in, the kids recognize they're nice people, they're friendly, they're not people who, in some sense there was some regret about their going, but the sense that they're just not really contributing as much to the school as other people are.
All right, so Peter, so walk us through the theory behind this, because it sounds like I have done lots of birthday parties for my kids, and we take them to different, where there's lots of kids. I mean, you envision that, and it's just chaos, right? So I would say for those that are listening who are used to this sacred cow of Common Core, or the traditional school system, and protect that to the to the highest levels. I mean, to them, they're probably saying, "You guys are crazy. I'm going to turn off this podcast." Maybe walk through the theory, because I didn't grow up in that school system, but at the same time, this is intriguing to me because I did not like school. And I, reading your book and knowing your theory, I really want to dissect that just so the audience understands that it's not chaos. And this is, a very healthy way in so many respects in which children develop.
Yeah, it's definitely not chaos. The school has lots of rules. The rules made democratically, and because they're made democratically, they're pretty well respected by the kids, and they're enforced democratically. Really, the people who founded the school didn't so much found it on the basis of a theory of education. They founded it on the basis of a theory of democracy.
Okay.
The founders believe that in a democracy, and they're very big on American democratic principles and the basic human rights and methods of democracy, and they felt it's just not, here we are espousing these democratic principles, and yet we are raising our children in schools, sending our children to schools that, in the words of Danny Greenberg, the primary founder of the school, is the least democratic institution that we have. it's the most autocratic, and children have no rights in school. So they hear about human rights, they hear about democracy, but they're not practicing it in school. So they, not surprisingly, they grow up kind of cynical about democracy, right? And so the view of the founders of the school was that in a democratic country, we want children growing up really understanding democracy. And the only way you can understand it is if you experience it, where you have the rights and privileges that go with being a democratic citizen. So the children, as young as 4, are full democratic citizens of this community. So that was the founding principle. They believed on faith that children, given freedom, given opportunities, would learn what they need to know. They just took that on faith. Now, most people wouldn't take that on faith. I didn't take it on faith. I needed some evidence for that. I needed to see that they were learning. So then I got interested in how they're learning. They clearly are learning in the sense that they're going on educated, right? They're all learning different things, but everybody learns to read, not at the same time. Some kids learn early, some late. Everybody learns to use numbers to the degree you need numbers in our culture. We're a literate culture. So not surprisingly, living in this culture, you pick up reading and writing, and you pick up numbers to the degree that you need them. And if you go into something that uses sort of calculations beyond the kind of calculations that you need in everyday life, you learn those calculations. So I got interested in what children are doing there at the school. And so I had a graduate student, one of my PhD students, who did his doctoral thesis, spending many, many days at the school as kind of a fly on the wall, just making observations systematically about children's interactions at the school. One of the things that the staff members told us is that the school works because it's age mixed, because younger children are freely interacting with older children and vice versa. The suggestion was that if you try to do a school like this and you segregated children by age, it wouldn't work. The reason is children are learning from one another, and children are especially attuned to those children who are a little older than themselves, a little bit more far along. The children for example, for a 5-year-old, the 7 or 8-year-old is a much more cool and useful model than an adult is. If a 5-year-old sees a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old reading and talking about books or climbing trees or doing whatever it is they're doing, the 5-year-old wants to do that and thinks, wow, this person can do it, and this person isn't that much bigger than me, and maybe I could do that too. So they're powerful models. If a 5-year-old who sees an adult reading books, that's no big deal at all. Adults are in a whole different world. They're that doesn't mean I could read books, but if a 7-year-old is doing it. So the modeling that occurs, in addition, the interactions, that one of the things we found is that the children don't segregate themselves by age. The younger kids are attracted to the older kids, and believe it or not, the older kids are attracted to the younger kids. They like to play with younger kids, and they play all kinds of games in an age-mixed way. And whenever that occurs, the older children are boosting the younger ones up to a higher level of activity.
Yeah.
So in this day and age, they might be playing a computer game, and the computer game involves words on a screen, and you've got to read the words. And some of the kids can read, and some can't. The ones who can read are, in some sense, teaching the younger ones to read, not because they're teaching them to read, but just because in playing the game, they're pointing out the words and sometimes even pointing out, there's a code here. You could, these letters have sounds. You can hear them talking about that. Or they're playing games that involve numbers and calculations, and they're showing the younger ones how to add or divide or do whatever you have to do to calculate the average score. Some of the computer games these days are involve amazingly complex mathematics, as well as the other kinds of logical thinking. So outdoors, the older children are scaffolding the younger ones into various kinds of sports that they wouldn't be able to play on their own. They wouldn't be able to organize it on their own. They wouldn't be, one of the examples I like to give is if you had just all 4-year-olds in a school, you could never have a simple game of catch because no 4-year-old can throw the ball straight enough for the other one to catch it, and no 4-year-old can leap and jump and catch the wild throw of another 4-year-old. But put an 8-year-old in the mix, and suddenly catch is possible, and they can both enjoy the game, and they're both stretching their abilities because the 8-year-old can throw the ball directly into the hands of the 4-year-old, and the 8-year-old can run and catch the 4-year-old's wild throws. So this kind of scaffolding is occurring all the time at the school. And it's really and truly the key to how children learn. Now, what's interesting to me, later on I got interested in hunter-gatherer cultures. And I had a colleague at Boston College who herself had lived in a particular hunter-gatherer culture for many months. And she was telling me about the children's lives in such cultures. And I said, that's a lot like Sudbury Valley School. The adults in that culture believe that children learn by playing and exploring, and the children believe it or not, from age 4 through their teenage years, just like at Sudbury Valley, are free to play and explore pretty much all day long. They're not expected to do any serious work. There's nothing that is called teaching in this culture, although adults might point out which mushrooms are poisonous or those types of things. But, they don't go out and give them lessons in how to use a bow and arrow or how to track game or how to find hidden roots and so on. They just expect children to observe and learn and practice in their own ways through play. And so the children are afforded an enormous amount of time to play and explore, and they play in the age-mixed groups away from the adults, and they're playing in ways that they acquire all the kinds of skills that you need in that society. So the same thing is occurring at Sudbury Valley, but they're playing at the kinds of skills important to hunter-gatherers. They're playing with bows and arrows and tracking and digging sticks and building dugout canoes and making the kinds of instruments and singing the songs of their culture. And children at Sudbury Valley, of course, these days are playing with computers. Why wouldn't they? That's the most important tool of our culture, very clearly today. They're playing with all kinds of they're playing with cooking equipment. They're playing in many cases with woodworking equipment and so forth, sporting equipment, they're reading books. They're doing the kinds of things that are important to our culture. So I developed this idea that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. And as I'm really an evolutionary-oriented psychologist, even my previous work on the brain was founded kind of on principles of Darwinian evolutionary psychology. And so we have been a species we have been human beings transferring culture from generation to generation now for at least 100,000 years. Some would say 1,000,000 years. It's a little different. Archaeologists and anthropologists have different views on that. Schools have only been around and common for only about 150 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So throughout essentially all of our biological evolution, if these observations regarding hunter-gatherer cultures are correct, children were educating themselves. And in fact, it wasn't just that one hunter-gatherer culture. I ended up surveying anthropologists who had studied 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures on 3 different continents with the same findings basically for every one of them. So if these modern-day hunter-gatherer cultures who sort of survived into, most of this research was done in the mid to late 20th century, survived into that time, represent the way we lived before agriculture, we can be pretty sure that children were playing and exploring and educating themselves that way throughout human history until very, very recent times. What this means to me is that, these characteristics that we think of as the almost the defining characteristics of childhood, their curiosity. Think of how curious little children are before they start school. They get into everything. They want to know everything. As soon as they can talk, they're asking questions. You can't stop them from exploring every new object. They want to explore it, see what this does. They want, as soon as they can talk, they want to explore your mind using words, especially as they begin to get older. So their curiosity
squelched, but that it becomes squelched with just the dynamic that exists in the typical education.
Well, that's right. So what happens is once they go to school, their questions don't count anymore. Their curiosity is just a disruption, and they are told, that we don't have time for that. We have to work on the questions of the curriculum. And they're not even the real questions of the teacher. These are just the questions of the curriculum that somebody has decided these are the questions that children are supposed to answer, and they've also decided there are certain right answers to them, right? And what children are supposed to do is they're supposed to learn the right answers to these questions. So that's what education is. Curiosity gets squelched. Children would not just lose their curiosity automatically once they're 5 or 6 years old. We take it away from them by telling them that their questions don't count. And another human instinct, of course, is playfulness. And when you look at children who are really free to play in any culture, when they're free to play for hours a day, which they're meant to be able to do, they play at all of the kinds of skills that are important to human beings everywhere. They play at physical skills. That's how they develop. They play at rough and tumble and chasing one another around. That's how they develop their bodies. They play at climbing. They play at building things. It's how they learn to use those opposable thumbs that we humans have. They play with language, and that's how they become sophisticated with language. They play socially, of course. All children everywhere want to play with other kids more than anything else in the world, and they learn social skills that do it. They play at dangerous things. Isn't that interesting? Other mammals do the same thing. They climb trees to the point where they feel frightened. They do all kinds of things that are somewhat frightening, and other mammals do that too. And what are they doing? They're learning courage when they do that. They're learning, I can do that. I can put myself into a frightening situation, and I can keep my head together, and I can get down and live to tell the tale. And that's how children develop the ability to face real emergencies in life. In play, they're free to fail. Nobody's judging them. So they grow up thinking it's okay to take risks. I can take risks. And if it doesn't work out, so what? I just try it again, or I try it a somewhat different way. Children are doing that all the time in play.
And that's not the principle of typical education, where if you make a mistake, you're branded a certain way. And I think probably psychologically that affects you in the long term.
So school teaches you really not to take risks. School teaches you to do the tried and true, to do what you already know how to do, and even do that kind of carefully and timidly, because somebody might judge you as wrong, might give you a low grade if you do it in some crazy creative way that the teacher doesn't understand what you're doing. So you really can't be creative in school, or you have very little. Shouldn't say you can't, and there's some opportunities too, but very little opportunity to be creative. Play is called recess. It's a break from school, and increasingly we don't even have recess anymore in many schools, or it's been reduced to almost nothing, something like 15 or 20 minutes for many elementary school children. And then we diagnose kids with ADHD if they have difficulty sitting still all that time and doing the kind of boring work that they're being asked to do.
So this is what Peter, as you've been talking, there's so much that resonates, and I would say it aligns with my situation, because I have a young son, but I have a 11-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old daughter, and the dynamic of their relationship is so powerful, because it hits on just how much Jack looks up to them and how much he learns from them. I mean, he's not even 4, and he's speaking full sentences. And, he has great conversations with them. It's profound. But then my daughters, and this is where I discovered your book, which was a little less than about 6 months ago. My business coach told me about it, because I was relating to him a situation I had with my oldest daughter, where she didn't get good grades. And I got very, upset with her. And then I caught myself, and I realized that, just the education system is not conducive to, I would say, I don't know if it's all personalities, but, she's very creative. She loves dance. She loves, ballet and gymnastics, and she doesn't like the science or the math. I mean, it's not intriguing to her, but yet she's forced to do it and then punished for not doing it well. And that, I saw the hurt in her. And her and I had a several hour drive where I had to apologize. But it's one of those things where I look at the education model, and it isn't that old. And it was, and you have to correct me here, because I don't know the history behind it, but I know that a lot of the birth of our modern school system was in Massachusetts, right? And it was modeled more after the Germany or Prussian system, where it did have that, classroom of all the same ages, and it was, confined to these, physical boundaries, right? And it was to train military and train factory workers. And so correct me if I'm wrong there, but I know that, kind of Horace Mann took the model and instituted that in Massachusetts, and it took hold throughout the rest of the country. And it's just, perpetuated on since then.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, schools in some sense really got their start as far back as the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants believed it was important for everybody to read the Bible, so they began first having Sunday schools to teach reading, so people could read the Bible, and then they became regular schools. But So the purpose of those schools that started off often especially in Prussia, was to teach reading, but even more than teaching reading, it was to indoctrinate children in biblical doctrine, right? And also to teach obedience. So the purpose of the original schools, which were Protestant-run schools, was obedience training and indoctrination. That was clearly the purpose. No way were they interested in critical thinking. Critical thinking was bad. No way were they interested in creativity. I mean, this was a time, remember, that willfulness is sinfulness.
Disobedient.
The whole job of raising children was to get them to obey. Children would be beaten if they talk back, if they don't obey. And schools arose out of that, and originally for religious reasons, but then as states became more powerful, states took them over, but still pretty much for the same purposes, obedience training. And in Massachusetts, as you say, where, you know, the Horace Mann created the first compulsory state-run school system, it was very clear that the purpose, you know, his view was, you know, we've got all these people coming from foreign countries. We've got to get everybody kind of thinking the same way. We've got to get people, it wasn't to create diversity of thought, it wasn't to create original thought, it was to create a narrowing, a funneling of thought. We need people, you know, people were very distrustful, not just Horace Mann, all the kind of elites were distrustful of democracy. And so the way that democracy was going to work, and they didn't use this word, but you were going to kind of brainwash people so that everybody would grow up to have certain beliefs, certain common beliefs. And it wasn't so much, what's interesting, and I learned this kind of looking back historically, is that it really in Massachusetts and in the colonies in general, children, almost all children could read, even before there were schools. You didn't really need schools to teach children to read. The bigger concern was what they read. You know, the bigger concern was that people were reading, you know, they were reading stuff that might create revolutions. You know, they were reading, and of course, even after, so the idea was to control children. And the first schools, it was only a few weeks a year that children went to school. And so school was still a fairly minor part of people's lives. Now, what has happened ever since school became compulsory, is they become a bigger part of childhood. So even when I was a kid, even when I was in elementary school, so now you kind of know how old I am, was back in the 1950s, school was not the big deal it is today. The school year was, even then in the 1950s, was 5 weeks shorter than it is today. We had a whole extra month in the summer. We had an extra week of vacation. We had, there was never any homework in elementary school when I was a kid. Once in a while a teacher might ask us to write a poem or a story at home, but never did we take books or worksheets back and forth between school and home. And believe it or not, I'm not sure if this was true in every grade, but I know that in 5th and 6th grade, because I remember that very clearly, we had a 6-hour school day, but we were outdoors 2 of those hours. So we had half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, half-hour in the middle of the afternoon, and a full hour at lunch. So we were never indoors in our seats more than an hour at a time. You know, and there was kind of a, and so what has happened since then is school has just gradually, year by year, decade by decade, subsumed increasing parts of children's lives. Homework, once you've got homework and you begin to elicit parents as having to sign off on homework, and parents are supposed to make sure their kids do the homework and even in some ways help. So parents become like assistant teachers. And so parents now are on the kid's case, you know, and you can't get away from school. I mean, you've got school at home. Your parents now are like teachers, making you do that homework. Summer is no longer totally free. You've got summer reading, for God's sake. You're not even allowed to choose your own books in the summer if you're, fortunately, most kids ignore the summer reading, and they, you know, and most parents let them get away with it. But if your parents are serious about it and they're on your case in the summer, even then you're not free from school. After school, instead of just going outdoors and playing and just following your own interests and finding the kids in the neighborhood to play with, now we've got all kinds of adult organized school-like activities, whether they're youth sports run by adults or their Chinese calligraphy classes or karate or whatever it is. You're off doing some school-like adult-led activity. where do you have the opportunity to learn what you actually like to do? Where do you have the opportunity
There
to
isn't. Yeah.
really play and explore, discover what you wanted to do? So when I was a kid, it was still possible. I like to say that I had school, but I also had a hunter-gatherer education. I spent more time outdoors playing with other kids than I spent in school. And that was true for most kids at that time. Playing, exploring, developing hobbies, figuring out things that adults knew what you were doing, and you developed interests. I developed a lot of different interests, and I developed a lot of skills. When I look back, even though I've been in school all my life in a sense, right? The skills that I learned as a child and as a teenager that are really important to me, far more of them come from my life of play and exploration out of school than come from anything that happened in school.
So Peter, we're having this conversation, and what keeps going through my mind is that there's this pervasive problem throughout the entire country, where kids don't like learning, okay, or going to school. I mean, they don't like school. I think kids are curious naturally and want to learn, but this just completely impedes that curiosity to an extent. But you also have jam-packed schedules. You have extracurricular activities, and the homework is just ridiculous sometimes. And it's not the amount; it's the nature of the homework. And then you look at the correlative issues that our youth are having, whether it's obesity, or, as you mentioned, diagnosis of certain disorders, which they're prescribing destructive medications. But then you have suicide. There's child suicide. I mean, even here in Utah, it's a very family-oriented community. There's suicides going on. And do you make as you've researched this and learned about this over the years, are you correlating really the direction of education with really some of these challenges that we're facing as a society?
Yeah, this is something I've written quite a bit about. Over this same kind of 60-year period from the mid-1950s until today, as school has gradually taken over more and more of children's lives, and as we have made school more and more anxiety-provoking, not just because there's more of it, but we put so much more emphasis on grades. We put more emphasis on testing. We have all these honors classes, and somehow kids are led to believe if they don't make it into the honors classes and do well, or into the advanced placement classes and do well, their lives are going to be ruined somehow. Parents, somehow convince them of that. Teachers convince society in general convinces them of that. So even those kids who are doing well in school, they worry they're not doing well enough if they're not getting A's in the honors classes, or not going to be valedictorian. I mean, we have basically put children into a situation through school and through kind of competitive activities outside of school in which they are constantly feeling like they're in competition with other kids. You're in that situation, and that is always an anxiety-provoking situation. And they're being deprived of play. So what's happened over this same period of time, and to me it's a no-brainer that there's a cause-effect relationship here. There's well-documented dramatic increase in depression among young people, in anxiety among young people, in suicide. So, and it's not just that we're identifying these things and we didn't before. Even by standard clinical questionnaires that have been given in normative groups over the decades, there have been dramatic changes. So, for example, just to give one example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the version of it for teenagers has been given to normative groups of teenagers since the 1940s. And there is a scale within it that assesses depression. And if you look at the cutoff for what today would be suspected major depressive disorder, the rate of young people who are above that cutoff is about 8 times what it was in the 1950s. And this has been a gradual increase. Similarly, there are questionnaires that assessing anxiety. And if you look at what would be the rate of the cutoff for suspected clinically significant generalized anxiety disorder, again, it's somewhere between 5 and 10-fold what it was in the 1950s. There's been a gradual increase. The suicide rate for children 15 and younger is now 6 times what it was in the 1950s. The suicide rate for young people between age 15 and 24 is about 3 times what it was in the 1950s. The suicide for old people like me has gone way down. We've become a better world for old people, and by this measure at least, a much worse world for children and teenagers. So to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, take play away from children's lives and life becomes pretty depressing. Put children in a situation in which they're constantly being judged and evaluated and measured and, and compared to other kids, being told they've got to get into some super college or they're going to be failures in life. And that's pretty anxiety-provoking. There was a study done just a couple of years ago by the American Psychological Society on anxiety in America, and they found that teenagers are the most anxious people in America, and that 83% of them, when asked what is a major source of your anxiety, point to school.
School.
So isn't that something? I mean, here, what we're doing, I believe it's child abuse. I believe what we are doing to children and teenagers is really abuse. Adults would not put up with it. You or I, if we had to do what children are forced to do, be in an environment where you have to ask to go to the bathroom, where you're not allowed to talk to your coworkers next to you, where you're not allowed to
collaborate, work in groups. Yep.
You're not allowed to collaborate. It's cheating if you collaborate, right? You and I would not put up for it, nor would any other adult. This would be regarded, as you probably know, that there's a way of kind of ranking careers in terms of how odious they are versus how fun they are. And the most odious careers are the ones where you're micromanaged, where you have essentially no control over what you yourself are allowed to do. And that's what we're putting our children in.
Well, I think the natural instinct of human nature is, we want freedom, we want independence, and that's what we're robbing kids of. And that curiosity is really building a foundation for their future. And I mean, it's a huge problem, and I see it. And so I know we don't have all day to talk about it, because I could talk to you seriously for another couple of hours, because I've come to love education, and it's not books. I love learning. I love discovery. I despised school, and now as an adult, I'm realizing that, and still looking at where our society is and what I have as a parent in regards to options. What would you, for the parents listening to this, what are some bits of advice? Like what direction do you give as far as where to start? Because it's an ominous problem, and it's kind of like, where can I make the biggest difference? Where do I start? Do I completely unplug my kid from school? And then, so it's one of those, like, where do you start? What are some of those?
More and more people are unplugging their kids from school. The U.S. government does a poll every 4 years of where school-age children are going to school. And every time they do it, a higher percentage of them are not going to school at all, are doing homeschooling of one sort or another. Most of them homeschooling, some of them in Sudbury type schools, but a large number of them in homeschools. Something like 4% of school-age children today are homeschooled, close to 4%. And an increasing number of those homeschoolers are calling themselves unschoolers because they're recognizing they don't have to do school at home. They don't have to give a curriculum. They don't have to test the kids. They don't have to say my kid is a sixth grader now and is doing sixth grade stuff. They find that the kids learn better if the kids are allowed to read what they want to read, and the adults end up kind of supporting the kids and helping them find playmates, getting them together. Sometimes they form community centers or learning centers where there might be courses offered there, but the kids can take them or not take them. So that's happening more and more. I would suggest for people who are possibly interested in this, I'm involved with a nonprofit called the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, ASDE, ASDE. Google that and you'll find a lot of information there. You can also find information on my blog and in my book about this, and there are many, many other books coming out. So, but if you're not ready to take that step, if you're not ready to take your child out of school for some kind of self-directed education, I think that the big lesson that's really important is all this propaganda about how important school is, how important it is that your child get top grades, make it into the best colleges. It's propaganda. It's not true. It's not true. When you look at who's successful in this society, many of them did not go to the top schools. In fact, there's research indicating, other things being equal, you come sort of from the same social class and so on and so forth. The one who goes to Harvard versus the one who goes to the local state college, they do as well. There's no evidence that you actually do better by going to that elite college. Nobody looks at your grades from high school later on in your life. The important thing really is to figure out what you like to do and figure out how to do it. And increasingly, we're beginning to find, it is still true, unfortunately, that a lot of employers, look for people who've got a college degree. And maybe some of them, they look for the more elite college, but more and more are recognizing that having a college degree, even from an elite college, does not mean you're prepared for this career. Nope. More and more employers are recognizing what you want is people who are passionate about that kind of job. And who are self-starters, who are creative, who are critical thinkers, and these are not fostered in school, and more employers are beginning to recognize that. So I think over the next few years, it's going to become even less important. I was talking to some people who are involved with a major toy company. And they say that they used to hire only college graduates. And then they realized, because they hired a few who weren't college graduates, the non-college graduates were at least as good, if not better. And they stopped looking at whether. They're just beginning to look at what kinds of attributes does this person have that they can bring to the job. And so that's beginning to happen. I honestly think that the days that we think of the four-year liberal arts college as sort of the transition from childhood to your career, I think those are numbered. I think we're recognizing that, if you took that same money, talk about money, you took that same money that parents are spending for their kids to go for that four-year job, you invested that into a good investment, put it into some kind of retirement investment. That's going to be a lot of money later on. And the kid is going to get an earlier start on a career. It's not at all clear that college, from a financial point of view, is a good investment. Of course, it depends a lot on what you've chosen to go into. And it's still the case that there are some kinds of careers that would be very difficult to go into, if not impossible, if you don't go to college. So, but I think that's going to change. I think we'll see the day before long that if you want to be a doctor, what's the point of going to a four-year liberal arts college? You don't learn anything about doctoring there.
Directly to medical school.
Instead of going to college, what you should be doing is you should be working in a hospital. You should be doing, even being an orderly, being an assistant to a nurse. You find out, do you like being around sick people? There you can see what doctors do. Do you really like being a doctor? You can get some skills that are relevant to being a doctor from there, go to medical school, And so I think the world is going to change in that direction. And some people think I'm overly optimistic, but I see the beginnings of that. And I think that schooling as we have been doing it is starting to burn itself out. It's sort of reached its logical conclusion. It's gone to such an extreme that more and more people are recognizing that not only is it not helpful, but it's actually harmful to the development of the kinds of characteristics that we want people to have as they go into adulthood.
Well, I'm agreeing with everything you're saying, and I've mentioned on this podcast before, and it's one of those things where kids and their access to information, there's very little that they cannot figure out and are figuring out. It's just one of those. It's still this societal belief that this is the way things are done. And I'm not sure if you follow Ron Paul and what he's doing with his Liberty Classroom and some of the other education, mainly for homeschool curriculum. And I had dinner with him a few months ago, and it's one of those, like, there's this increase in popularity. There's this increase in this, I don't know if it's going slow. I don't know the universal statistics, but because of technology, there's so much access to meaningful information and meaningful education, where it isn't this dictatorial type of system where kids are supposed to be fit into this square box, right? Regardless of what their personality is, regardless of who they are. And I've hired hundreds of people over the years, and I do not care about with my experience with employees and culture and initiative, and I have a little bit different of a business, that it's not important. And I think a lot of other businesses are realizing it. So it needs to happen, because education is just, I don't know, it's been bastardized. And I like I said before, I love to learn. I love to discover that, but that's not what kids are coming to understand as education. At least mine are concerned. And we've mentioned many here, but we're going to list all of your, we have your book, right? And we're going to put, links to that, links to the blog, links to your, the nonprofit that you are involved with. We'll put that all on the blog and all through the show notes and the emails that we send out. But if there's anything else you want to mention as far as resources or first steps, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, well, again, if I would encourage people to take a look at the webpage, at the website for the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. There's another nonprofit that I'm involved with, along with Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the wonderful book Free Range Kids. And that nonprofit is called Let Grow. And what we're trying to do there is to bring back free play, free neighborhood play, bring back play opportunities, help working with communities and working with schools to create opportunities for children to get together with other children and play in a wide variety of ways, in self-directed play without adults telling them what to do. So that's another endeavor that we're involved with, that I'm involved with. So,
well, we're going to do our best to spread the word, because a lot of your research, a lot of what's been said on this on this episode, it's something that I feel strongly and deeply about, and I know that there are a lot of individuals that are becoming fed up and frustrated with what has become the status quo. And so thank you for your research. Thank you for your involvement in these groups. And I know it's going to make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest, and it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us as the Wealth Standard Podcast spends all of 2018 celebrating life, liberty, and property. Be sure to leave us a review on iTunes, and we'll see you on the next one.